All right, we're going to look at ecosystem organization and function. This will be framed in the context of the basic physical laws. We're looking at energy flow and biogeochemical cycles through processes like photosynthesis, respiration, consumption. So all of this is occurring through the food chains and the food webs. It's where carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus are passed from one organism to the rest within the system, and calories flow up the food chain. A lot of ecosystem ecology is influenced by the abiotic component, the non-living components: water, nutrients, sunlight, temperature. Generally, there's one factor that limits the growth of a plant. These Joshua trees shown here, you could fertilize them. It's not going to make them grow faster. They need water. That's the thing that's in short supply within this system. The basic physical laws: law of conservation of matter. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. So as nutrients are taken up by plants, that nitrogen atom, that phosphorus atom is not destroyed. It's just converted from one form to another. As an animal eats the plant, it passes on those nitrogen and phosphorus atoms. So matter is neither created nor destroyed. First law of thermodynamics is that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It's converted from one form to another, but the sunlight then provides the energy for the plants then provide the energy for the herbivores, etc., etc. It's not created, it's not destroyed. It can convert from one form to another as it's eaten. It can be released as heat, but it's not ultimately destroyed. Second law of thermodynamics is that energy changes form. Some of that energy is converted from a more useful form to a less useful form. So from sunlight into heat, as the plant doesn't absorb all of the energy, some of that's released as heat. Same thing with every link in the food chain. There's a conversion of energy from one form to another, so it's less than 100% efficient because of the second law of thermodynamics. So as somebody is pushing a ball over the hill, initially there's high potential energy. The activation energy is the energy input that he puts into it to push it over the hill, required to start the rock rolling. Then that potential energy is converted into kinetic energy, which is the energy of motion. And then at the end of this, there's lower potential energy. We didn't destroy the calories. It's just converted to heat and so the energy wasn't destroyed. Literally, you'd have to add up all of the heat from the frictional forces as the rock is rolling down the hill. But ultimately, it's all there because the energy is neither created nor destroyed. First law of thermodynamics. The leftover energy is that heat, and it's less useful because you can't roll a ball up a hill based on the heat. Same sort of thing with plants. The sun might have 100 units of energy. The plant's able to capture 2 units of energy. The rest is released as dispersed energy, heat, as you see the red waves here in this. As a plant, energy is captured by the plant. It's not destroyed. It's converted from sunlight to glucose. It's used to form bonds in glucose and store the energy there. Some of it's degraded to heat, a less useful form. And the energy efficiency is always less than 100%. Every link in the food chain, less than 100% efficient. So we can only have so many links in the food chain. So the laws of thermodynamics then are at play and function throughout the entire food chain. During each link in the food chain, some of that energy is converted to a less useful form. So you see the heat loss coming off at each trophic level. And therefore, you lose about 90% of the heat with each link in the food chain. 10% is passed on. So the arrows you see are getting thinner and thinner because there's less and less energy available to the next trophic level. We know this as the 10% rule. Our rule of thumb is that 10% of the calories are passed on from plants to herbivores, from herbivores to carnivores, etc. So overall, don't worry about the numbers here, but just to give you a sense of the global energy flow, out of all the sunlight available, a third of it's reflected back. Only about 0.2% actually ends up being captured by plants. Other parts will hit the earth. The plants can be 2% efficient, but that's only if the sunlight hits them. The remainder heats land and water, and you have it converted to heat, less useful, and the outflowing radiation equals that of the inflowing radiation. We measure this to get a sense of primary production, the amount of plant growth. I'm an aquatic ecologist, and so we'll use these BOD bottles to do that. It's basically a small container. You can take a sample of lake water, strain it to get rid of the zooplankton. You just have algae left, place them in these bottles, and then it's a measure of the energy captured by the algae in this case. It's measured using either radioactive carbon or change in oxygen, because as the plant photosynthesizes, it's going to release oxygen, and that increases the oxygen concentration. So that's an easy way to measure it. In the dark bottle, you don't have photosynthesis taking place, but you do have respiration. The plants have to burn some of the sugars that they formerly photosynthesized, so respiration occurs there. In the light bottle, both photosynthesis and respiration. So if we want to calculate what happens, you can use the difference between the two of them to basically factor out respiration and get total gross photosynthesis. In the left-hand bottle, the clear bottle, you're going to have net primary production, which is it's after you take into account respiration, because photosynthesis and respiration occur in the light bottle. The dark bottle is just respiration. And so the net primary production, or NPP, is equal to photosynthesis minus the difference that we see in the dark bottle, the respiration bottle. Now, you might think of this in terms of net production versus gross production. And you might think of that in the same way that you think of your paycheck. If you have a job, there's on your check, it'll say this is the gross pay and then this is the net pay. The net pay is after they take out Social Security and other taxes, okay? So that's like respiration in an ecosystem. The gross production is the photosynthesis itself before you factor in any, you subtract off the respiration to just get photosynthesis by itself. That's gross primary production. If you then take off the respiration taxes, the taxes organisms have to pay to stay alive, so to speak, then that gives you the net production, the actual plant growth within the system. So in this case, you can do it in a bottle. For leaves, they have this meter that you kind of just clamp on the side of a plant, and it can actually measure primary production at the leaf level under different light conditions. Pretty cool. So this then gives us our estimate of energy flow in the system. If we have 1,000,000 joules of sunlight, you might only have 10,000 joules of plant growth, so 1% efficient. They're 2% gross efficiency, and then they have to burn half of those calories, so they end up being a net efficiency of about 1%. From there, it's about 10% efficient as you go up the food chain. So 10,000 joules of plants will yield 1,000 joules of herbivores, 100 joules of secondary carnivores, and then the tertiary consumers 10 joules, because it decreases by 90%. At each link in the food chain, the energy is lost as heat, converted to a less useful state. Second law of thermodynamics. So this causes us to have a pyramid of energy, more calories at more production at the base compared to at each of the higher trophic levels. So it's not always exactly 10%, but 10% is our rule of thumb. It's pyramid shaped because there's fewer and fewer calories as you get higher up the food chain, because of the second law of thermodynamics. Same sort of thing for the pyramid of biomass. There's usually more biomass at the base of the food chain, very little making its way to the top. Per unit of area, plants dominate the tropical rainforest. But there are actually a lot of decomposers, because there's a lot of leaves and dead wood in the rainforest, and nutrients are cycled very rapidly. Tropical rainforests have actually poor soil nutrient content, and so there's rapid recycling of the nutrients and uptake by the other plants there. Same sort of thing for a pyramid of numbers. Generally, you expect there to be more individuals at the base and fewer as you get higher up the food chain. There might be some systems where, like a few big trees, nothing else, you would have technically this, then it still only counts as one tree, but you could have lots and lots of bugs living on it. So there could be some where it's not exactly a pyramid. For numbers only, biomass and calories, usually there's more at the in terms of net primary production, these maps show how much plant growth there is in each of the ecosystems of the world. You can see high productivity in tropical areas and temperate areas, low productivity where there's low water, like in the polar deserts and the Sahara. And in general, that's going to have an effect. Water availability and nutrients are going to have a big effect on production. In the oceans, it's a lot of it's nutrient availability. And so off the coasts, you can see there's coastal inputs of nutrients through runoff water. There's also upwelling that occurs in many of those spots, bringing nutrients from the deep water up to the surface, which stimulates phytoplankton production. And then at certain latitudes, they're more productive or less productive than others. Overall, across ecosystem types, the most productive ecosystems are swamps, marshes, tropical forest, algae beds, algae reefs. The kelp forest that I showed you in a prior PowerPoint, that kelp could grow a meter per day under ideal high nutrient conditions. Just to put it in perspective how productive these systems are. At the bottom end, tundra, desert scrub, extreme desert, open ocean, not very productive. There's either not a whole lot of nutrients or they're missing something, like in the open ocean, often iron is in short supply, way far away from shore, and that can affect that. Energy flow in the ecosystems generally originates from the sun, unless you have a system like the deep sea hydrothermal vents that are fueled by chemosynthesis, from the producers to the consumers, the secondary consumers to the tertiary consumers, and then through the decomposers. The energy, this is an example from a Georgia salt marsh by Teal and colleagues. It was published in the book, McCluskey, The Estuarine Ecosystem, but the original study was by Teal. And then this, you might have 2.5 million units of energy. The gross primary production for the cordgrass would be 152,000, but it's going to burn 70% of that just to stay alive in a harsh environment, which is the 118,000 you see at the bottom. Subtract that off, and you end up with the net primary production, about 34,000 units of energy. From there, the vast majority of it makes its way into the detritus food web. The grazer food web, much less abundant, relying on the plants directly versus waiting for microbes to break them down. Bacteria, that's food for crabs, fiddler crabs, nematodes, things like that. And then ultimately, about half of the calories from the net primary production make their way out of the food chain, being exported in the tides. As the tides cover and uncover the area, some of this can get washed away, causing adjacent ecosystems to be more productive or supporting bivalves and things like that. All right, the biogeochemical cycles represent the cycling of materials through the biotic component, the living things, the geologic component, and the chemical components of the biosphere. We're going to kind of quickly go through water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. For the level of this class, I'm not going to be super nitpicky on the details, but know that nitrogen and phosphorus are nutrients in the system. So the water cycles through the world through precipitation and evaporation. Water evaporates from the ocean, and net movement of this across land. There's precipitation. There's also evapotranspiration from the land, but then the net effect is that runoff and groundwater bring this back to the ocean. In this diagram, it shows the surface water evaporation, condensation, precipitation. From there, there's basically 3 ways the water can go off. It can run off directly back into a surface water body. It can go down into the groundwater, or it can infiltrate into the surface soils and be absorbed by plant roots. From there, it's taken up to the leaves, released back into the atmosphere through a process called transpiration. Carbon is a balance of photosynthesis and respiration. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, taken up by plants during photosynthesis, eaten by consumers, eaten by higher consumers. They then respire the carbon back into the atmosphere. Death and decomposition can occur. This then breaks things down, putting it back in the atmosphere. Humans also will burn fossil fuels, which is fossil carbon that has been put into fossil storage many, many millions of years ago. You can see this on the left-hand side, the formation of fossil fuels over geological time, and then humans extracting that, combusting it, and putting it back into the atmosphere. You also see the producers here taking up atmospheric carbon, releasing it by respiration. Consumers eating the producers, decomposers ultimately breaking it down. And then same thing in the aquatic system. Carbon dioxide can dissolve in the water, be taken up by marine algae. Photosynthesis then supports marine activity. Volcanic activity also has a play. The factor that is increasing the atmospheric CO2 because it was in balance is human combustion of fossil fuels. Nitrogen, again, don't worry too much about the details. I'm going to kind of fly through this. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is bonded as N2 through a nitrogen-nitrogen triple bond. So it's pretty much inert. It's not really used directly by things. It's 78% of the atmosphere, but we don't use it directly. The only ones that can are nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They break that nitrogen-nitrogen triple bond and convert it to the form of ammonia, NH3, which then gets an added ion, NH4. This then goes through a process called nitrification, converting it from nitrate the ammonium. It'll convert it to from ammonium, NH4, to nitrite, which is NO2 minus, and then to NO3 minus. Different bacteria get energy from those chemical transformations, and both nitrate, NO3 minus, and ammonia are usable by plants for their nitrogen needs. It's taken up, it's used by plants, goes through the grazer food chain, recycled by decomposers back as ammonium. Then sometimes denitrifying bacteria will make their living by converting nitrate back to atmospheric N2. It's a way that they can get calories, but it removes it from the terrestrial system. This one shows kind of a simplified version. Atmospheric N2 broken apart by nitrogen-fixing bacteria and blue-green algae, forming a part of this ammonium nitrate pool in the soil, which fertilizes plants, which then feeds consumers. Death decomposition converts them back through ammonification to ammonia within the soil. We then simulate this through fertilizer production, applying lots of energy to break that nitrogen-nitrogen triple bond, producing anhydrous ammonia, which is then sprayed on crops to enhance agricultural productivity. Some of the nitrate then is denitrified and put back in the atmosphere, which you see on the dashed line. Phosphorus is a geological cycle, so it actually can be found in rocks, and it's released through the weathering of rocks. It can form soils, plants take it up, animals consume them, decomposers then cycle it back within the system. So this is the PO4 phosphate ion is cycled and recycled within the terrestrial system. It can also run off into the aquatic system where there's similar cycling of phosphorus. It can sediment out, and then ultimately new rocks are formed through geologic uplift of sedimentary rocks. Here's another diagram to illustrate this. Again, it's in the phosphate-bearing rocks. That's actually been mined for fertilizer production. In the past, they used to use the islands. Seabird islands will have a lot of bird crap on them, and they would harvest that. It's called guano, and it actually makes a really potent fertilizer. Then fertilizers and detergents can release that and add to the phosphate pool in the soil. Phosphate pool taken up by producers, eaten by consumers, wasted decomposition, cycle it back. Erosion can put it into the aquatic system. Similar cycling there in the aquatic system. Uptake by plants such as kelp, being eaten by herbivores, then eaten by carnivores such as the striped bass shown here. Striped bass is not going to eat kelp directly, and then cycling it back in the phosphate pool, dissolved phosphate pool. It can be sedimented out into ocean sediments, it can be brought back up through the process of upwelling, and ocean sediments then can form new phosphate-bearing rocks over geological time. So why would we say that energy flows through ecosystems but nutrients cycle? Energy flow is because of the laws of thermodynamics. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, but as it flows through the system, it gets less and less useful. Nutrients are neither created nor destroyed, so they're used and reused, cycled and recycled within the system. A phosphorus atom taken up by the plant, eaten by the consumer, eaten by a carnivore, cycled back through a decomposer, it's still a phosphorus atom. It's not changed, and so we say nutrient cycle. But energy flows because it's a one-way trip. You have to continually provide sunlight to then stimulate plant production.